Your hosts are here, Sammy and Michelle. By the end of this podcast, you'll know them well. Adulting, navigating the journey of life. Careers to relationships, pain and strife. Put down the rule book, rethink the status quo. If there's another direction you wanna go, find purpose, passion and mastery in all that you do with Status Post Adulting.
Hey, Status Post Adulting fam! This is Sammy
and Michelle,
and you're listening to the 67th episode of Status Post Adulting, where we are talking about emergency funds. And do you even need one? But first, let me check in with my co-host Michelle. How are you doing, Michelle?
I am good, Sammy. I was actually in Santa Fe this past weekend, did a girls' trip with some of my college friends, which was so fun. We've had it on the calendar for a while, and Santa Fe is a pretty cool city. I've never been. It's funny because it's a small town, but not our small town.
That would be extreme. It's on a map.
It's a capital. People know it. But it was definitely smaller than I expected, but super fun. We got to go hiking, do a spa day. It was just nice to catch up with my girlfriends and have a nice weekend together. What about you? How are you?
I'm doing good. While you were taking your little bottom to Santa Fe, I was meeting up with one of my girlfriends in Las Vegas. And my friend, Sarah from PA school, she also lives in a small town, so she was going to go get her hair done in Vegas, so it was a perfect time for us to meet up. And Vegas has tons to do, and it was a stark contrast to our life here because literally as soon as I crossed the hill and Vegas started to pop up, even just like the strip malls and everything, there were just like so many plazas and so many stores. The animal hospital was bigger than our regular hospital. So it was just very extreme.
I mean, I think everything is bigger than the regular hospital here, but I hear what you're saying.
And, I'm sure over there's a lot of opportunities to spend all your money and not keep any money saved up for an emergency.
That is the truth, Sammy. That's exactly what we're talking about today is emergency funds. It's a topic that Sammy and I have touched on in the past when we've talked about things like finance basics and things like that. We thought now in particular would be a good time to talk about it because a lot of people, it seems like, are starting to evaluate with the market going down, being inconsistent in 2022. People are really starting to think about their emergency fund and how much money they should have saved. And so we thought it would be a great topic to talk about today.
Exactly, Michelle. And we should probably start with what is an emergency fund? An emergency fund is a bank account or money that you have set aside to pay for large and unexpected expenses. This could be random medical bills, car expenses, home repairs, new appliances, any type of accident. These little situations always pop up, and sometimes they are not cheap. And that's why you have an emergency fund, so that these little expenses do not totally derail your progress.
Exactly, Sammy. An emergency fund is exactly what it sounds like, which is money that you have available in case something goes wrong. I would add to the definition, or how I think of an emergency fund, is money that is very liquid or money that you can access easily. So whether it's in your mattress or in your savings account, it's something that if you had to go to the bank today to get it, you definitely could.
Exactly. And the views and opinions that Michelle has just shared are not the views and opinions of everyone, which we'll get into later in this podcast. So you might be wondering why even have an emergency fund? Well, to begin with, emergency funds will help pay for those random things that always pop up. And they'll prevent you from going into credit card debt. They'll prevent you from being totally derailed by a random expense that occurs. But they also make you feel more comfortable. When you have that money set aside, I think there is a huge emotional / anxiety reducing cost that is incurred when you have cash set aside for emergencies.
Exactly, Sammy. An emergency fund is one of those things when you start to make money and you start to have the ability to save some money. It's one of the first things that a lot of people encourage you to start building, because once you go from being able to pay your expenses and pay your bills and you have a little bit of cash on hand, instead of burning through it, you want to make sure you have a little bit on hand so that if something does come up, you can pay for it. I know we've quoted this statistic before. I think it was from 2018, where they found that most Americans would not be able to handle an unexpected $400 expense.
That is very true, Michelle. And as someone who had recent car trouble, a $400 expense is pretty easy to incur.
So true, Sammy. Car troubles are rarely under $400.
I mean, I think mine is actually less than $400, but you get the picture. You get the picture.
Exactly, Sammy. So starting off, an emergency fund, typically if you ask a lot of finance gurus out there, Dave Ramsey, Ramin Sethi, a lot of these very popular finance gurus will say that you should have a 3 to 6 month emergency fund. And so what that means is that if something happened today and you had no income coming in, you would be able to cover your expenses, cover your needs for the next 3 to 6 months. And so a lot of times that's what we've said in the past. And that's usually a good rule of thumb if you're starting to think about, hey, how much money do I want to save? How much money should I have in my savings for an emergency fund?
Yes, Michelle, it's a good rule of thumb. But let me tell you, if you feel uncomfortable with the 3 to 6 month emergency fund, go ahead and keep more. The balance with an emergency fund is the money that you are keeping outside of investments to be your emergency fund is not being invested. So it is not accruing that much interest. Sure, maybe it has whatever measly pennies that you're making in your savings account, but generally emergency funds don't make a ton of money. And that's why some people say that there's a huge opportunity cost to keeping a large emergency fund. And that opportunity cost is missing out on investments.
Yeah, Sammy. Actually, it's interesting because I was just reading a blog article by Morgan Housel of The Psychology of Money on his blog for the Collaborative Fund. And he specifically talks about in this article called Never Saw It Coming, how, especially with inflation being really high right now, people are almost becoming what he calls like too smart for their own good because we're trying so hard to be efficient with our money. And he specifically says, quote, "The push to be efficient with your cash and hold as little as necessary explodes when inflation is high because people become paranoid about losing purchasing power." And what happens, and what I even saw happen for myself when I started to learn more about personal finance, it is possible to get obsessed about how much money should I have saved in case something happens versus am I losing out? Like, what is the opportunity cost? Should I make sure that every dime over 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund should be going investing or I'm losing money? And so I think that's really an important thing to think about because to your point, we do want to optimize as much as possible, but at the same time, you're trying to mitigate risk here. It's not necessarily about making the decision that's going to both keep you as safe as possible and make as much money as possible.
That's so true, Michelle. And it's really about your risk tolerance. And a lot of times we don't know our risk tolerance until we actually go through some adverse situations.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, I had about maybe a 6 months to 1 year emergency fund until March 2020 when the market briefly dropped. When the market dropped, my net worth drastically decreased. And I know this didn't even last maybe it was a few days or a week. But I felt that stress because I knew, if I have something happen to me that's going to cost more than my emergency fund, I'm going to have to draw down on my investments, which are already down because the market's down. And that would make me feel super uncomfortable. So now I keep a higher emergency fund, like realistically, probably over 2 years. Granted, I don't have a ton of spending, so it's not like it's a ton of money, but I keep an over 2 year emergency fund because that's what makes me feel comfortable. And that's what makes me feel like even if something bad happens, I won't have to draw down on my investments.
It's so true, Sammy. I think when COVID hit, that obviously put into perspective for a lot of people that something unexpected can happen. And there's no dollar amount to make us prepared for the unexpected. We say 3 months, 6 months, but anything can happen that can last for a really long time and affect our economy for a really long time. And if your money is tied up in investments, which is a good thing, right? We want your money to grow over time. But if your money is tied up in investments and the market goes down, you don't necessarily want to tap into that money, or it might not be enough money to cover your expenses. So I think you make a really good point. Sometimes we think about an emergency fund a little bit too late. We think about it when the emergency is happening.
And, we've been talking about emergency funds in terms of time rather than dollars. And I kind of wanted to address that real quick. So let's say you had like $100,000 in an emergency fund. Well, if you're a family of 4 who spends $100,000 every year, that's a 1-year emergency fund. Versus if you're a single woman who spends like $25,000 a year, that's a 4-year emergency fund. Emergency funds really vary person to person and depending on however much each person or each family spends. Because sure, you can have a ton of money in an emergency fund, but if you spend a ton of money, then it may not actually last you that long if you needed to.
That's a good point, Sammy. A 3-month emergency fund for me is going to look very different, I'm guessing, than a 3-month emergency fund for Cardi B or somebody who probably has more expenses than I do.
Your 3-month emergency fund is Cardi B's 1-day emergency fund.
Cardi B probably spends my emergency fund on shoes or like baby strollers.
And I also wanted to address some expenses that maybe are not part of your emergency fund. And that's upcoming expenses that you're going to have to pay for. Not everything's an emergency. For example, if you have like a wedding coming up, or if you're planning on having kids, or if you have a known car expense, like you're planning on buying a new car, or you're planning on buying a new house, those are not things that should come out of your emergency fund. That money you should already have designated separate from your emergency fund. You can keep all of these things in the same bank account, if you prefer to, but it's good to mentally have your emergency fund separated so that you don't just go taking out your emergency fund to pay your regular monthly expenses.
That's a good point, Sammy, because an emergency fund should be money that's in one of those metaphorical glass boxes that say break in case of emergency. It's not month to month you're like pulling out of there because you're spilling over on your purchases, or you went shopping, or you had a trip, or things like that. Those are all things that come up, and those are things you should consider when you're tracking your spending and budgeting and that sort of thing. But you want to get to a point when you're building your emergency fund that you aren't pulling from it if you don't have an emergency. Though you should also not be going into debt for it either.
Exactly. And that brings me to my next point, Michelle, which is there are actually people out there, hooligans, maybe you, if you are a risk-tolerant person, who don't believe in having an emergency fund. These people say that instead of having an emergency fund, you could either pull money from your stocks, use credit cards, use other lines of credit like a HELOC in the setting of an emergency. And their point is, why keep a hoard of cash that's not making any money, that's not building interest, saved up, if you have all these potential lines of credit that can help fund you in the case of an emergency?
Yeah, Sammy, I've heard that before. People often say that the money that you're saving and not investing is money that you may as well light on fire. Which, sure, there is value on that, right? We've talked about opportunity costs. We've talked about compounding before. You cannot use that as a rule of thumb when so many people in this country, in this world, are up to their eyeballs in debt. They don't have the financial knowledge or background to be taking out loans. People already have so many loans and student loans. I just feel like it's so irresponsible to tell people to do that. And also, when there's an emergency, a lot of times it's harder to get a loan. A lot of times it's harder to get approved for these type of things. The interest rate goes up. Sure, you can play that game if you want to, but it is a very big game that you're playing.
Exactly, Michelle. And that's exactly what I was thinking. There's those 2 points of why not having an emergency fund is not ideal. One is what you just talked about, which is that when you actually have an emergency, a lot of times it may be a time where you might not qualify for credit the same way because you don't have a job. Or it could even be like a time when the market's super down. So it's like the worst time to draw down on your investments. So that's a great point. Emergency situations are often different than our day-to-day situations. And for that reason, circumstances can be different when it comes to getting credit or taking out money from your stocks. the other issue is just that this mindset puts you into more debt. And I think one of the features of an emergency fund is it creates a sense of security. It creates that emotional shift from like scarcity to abundance because you know that you have a bunch of cash set aside in case you need to do anything, to if you need to like leave your job or exit a situation that's difficult, you feel anxious to do so because you know that will also mean incurring a bunch of debt.
Exactly, Sammy. It goes back to what Morgan Housel was saying about trying to over-optimize. Like, sure, I bet logically, if you put all of your money into an index fund over the long term, instead of having it in your savings account, you probably will make more money off of it over the long term. But it really puts you in a place where you're going to struggle to build wealth if something bad happens. If you consider how generational wealth is built, it's by not having debt, it's by building credit, it's by being able to build and pass along money and being able to purchase assets. And those type of things get very tied up if you're trying to play these games because you're so focused on optimizing your money.
That's so true, Michelle. And I remember, we went to multiple financial independence meetings when we were in the Bay Area, and we would talk about emergency funds. And that's when I really saw how much people really hoarded cash. And these people would be telling everybody in the group, keep 3 to 6 months of an emergency fund. And then so many people, when we actually asked how much do people have in their emergency fund, hundreds of thousands of dollars, many of these people would have in emergency funds. And I do think it's because, over time, the more money you have, the older you get, the wiser you get, you kind of feel like, I just want to keep a little bit more cash on me. You know that there is a cost to keeping the cash on you, but at the same time, you know that cash makes you comfortable and prevents you from making fear-based decisions.
It's so true, Sammy. It's so funny. Even Morgan Housel in The Psychology of Money. So many finance gurus talk about, oh yeah, you should have a 3 to 6 month emergency fund. And then it turns out they have like a 2-year emergency fund. Mm-hmm. And they're always like, well, it would look so bad if me, a financial guru, ran out of money. I think Scott Trench, A Bigger Pockets, talks about this as well. He's like, I wrote the book Set for Life. So they laugh it off. It's very casual. They're like, haha, I have, more than a 6-month emergency fund. And you're like, wait, all of you guys are doing this, but you're not talking about it? Meanwhile, you have some Yahoo going off on Twitter about how everybody should put all of their money in an index fund and shouldn't have any emergency fund because they can get all this debt and stuff. I think it's an important thing to address because when you look at the people who are really financially savvy and know a lot about personal finance, they're actually being less risk averse. And I think that's such a key thing.
I agree, Michelle. I was trying to find out how much Warren Buffett had in an emergency fund, and I couldn't find it. But I did find that Berkshire Hathaway, his investment company, keeps 69% in stocks, and they keep 28% in cash or cash equivalents, and only 3% in bonds.
Wow.
Yeah, so he has billions in cash, many, many billions in cash.
All the billions.
And it's just for security. People feel more comfortable and people make less irrational decisions when they have more cash.
That's such a good point, Sammy, because a really good example to this is in March 2020, we really saw how many businesses went out of business because they have these thin margins and they couldn't last without their sales for a few weeks. And I don't own a business, so I know that sometimes you have to maintain it at a different level. But the fact that somebody who is a finance guru, somebody who invests a lot of money, has so much cash on reserves, definitely says something.
I agree, Michelle. And I think, we hear about a lot of people when the market's starting to tank, they take out all their money, even though, they should be investing for the long term. So who cares if the market's down for the next 5 years? And then they have to then predict when to put all their money back into the market at the most optimal time. And they're playing all these games. And I really think it's because you don't have the emergency fund. If you have the emergency fund, then chill. You don't have to take this money out for decades. Don't even look at it. And I think that becomes more and more true the more money you have. I think, once you become Coast Fire, and Coast Fire again is when you have enough money saved up that if you didn't invest any more money, you would be able to retire at traditional retirement age of 65. So let's say once you're coast-fire and you've got your nest egg rolling and you know that you don't have to worry about investing more money until that age, of course you'd want to keep a large emergency fund, because why would you draw down on your nest egg, your investments that's already set to manage your wealth once you're in retirement?
I totally agree with that, Sammy. For me, I always felt like I had too much money in my savings, and I did. I made some changes when I was reevaluating my personal finances, but when I left my job and I decided not to look for a new one, the biggest thing that helped me make that decision was I knew I had some money in investments, but I also knew that I had a good amount of money in savings that I could live off of until I wanted to find a new job. So an emergency fund is great when you have an emergency, and it can also make something like leaving your job something that could be really upsetting. It can actually be very freeing, because all of a sudden now I have built a little bit of financial independence for myself for a couple of years.
Yes, Michelle, that's exactly why having cash in particular feels so good. It's just such a safety blanket that allows you to be more financially independent in the decisions that you make.
Exactly, Sammy. And I'll add to that too, when it comes to things like debt, the more debt you have, your car payments, your house payments, your Affirm payment for that Gucci bag, I don't know, whatever you're in debt for, the more debt you have also means the more money you owe when you have an emergency fund. So that's also something really important to keep in mind. If you are able to pay off any loans that you have, get yourself out of credit card debt, you're also putting yourself in a stronger position if you are in an emergency, because those are now bills that you don't have to worry about someone calling and saying, hey, why aren't you paying this?
Yeah, Michelle. I think this Affirm thing was literally created so that people have to go to work and the United States workforce will never be gone because people have bought things that they still owe money on.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You can get a line of credit for anything these days.
The last point that I wanted to bring up is how people might want to keep more cash with them as they get closer to retirement. And this is because of something called sequence of return risk. So sequence of return risk is specifically talking about how the order in which the market goes up or down after you retire can affect your nest egg and your ability to continue living off your nest egg quite a bit. Specifically, let's say you retire and the market's at a high and you still only take out 4% of that nest egg to live off each year, but the market's going up 12%, you're making a huge profit in those beginning years. You've just increased your nest egg a lot, and that's going to continue to then exponentially increase. On the other hand, let's say you retire and the market immediately tanks 20%. And then on top of that, you take out a 4% withdrawal rate for your spending for the year. So you're now down 24%. And you're starting out with a smaller nest egg. So your growth over time is going to be less. And there is some potential that you could actually run out of money.
So what's the fix there?
So the fix is if you have a large cash cushion and you retire and the market's down, you keep your cash so you don't actually have to withdraw from your investments. So by keeping your cash, you just spend the cash that you have. The market goes down 20%, but you don't have to withdraw anything. You just let the market go down 20% and it doesn't affect you. It would be just the same as when you were investing and not touching your money, because the market's going down, the market's going up. Either way, you're not taking out any money. So it's not like you're taking out on a low.
That makes sense. So the goal is that you have a little bit of a reserve that you can tap into in case the market is going down and you don't want to take money out in a down market.
Exactly.
But then I guess you also don't want to take money out in an up market.
Well, it's actually okay to take money. I mean, you're saving this money so that you can eventually spend it, So if there were ever a time to take it out, it is in the up market. And the worst time to take out that money retirement-wise, based on these studies that they have about the sequence of return risk, is in those first few years after retirement. In those first few years, those are your really critical years for letting your nest egg grow. And if you have to withdraw on a down market, it can really affect you negatively. So if you have this cash cushion, so you don't have to withdraw, that will help you out a lot. And we can post a link to Big Earn, of early retirement now. He has really great information on sequence of return risk so that you guys can read into this deeper if you're going to be retiring soon or if you're just interested.
That's great, Sammy. And so for takeaways this week, I think the biggest thing is 1, be aware of what an emergency fund is. Truly, I think a lot of people have a concept of it, but take a second. Look, how much money do I have saved somewhere that's liquid, that if something happened today and I had no income, how long would I last based off of my current expenses? I think it's just good to know that number first and foremost, because that will tell you truly in an emergency what will happen. And if it's lower than you want, start to put a little bit more money towards it. It's good to be in a position where you almost feel a little bit like, hey, am I saving a little bit too much? I think that's a good place to be, especially since in the last couple of years, we just really, really, really have seen how erratic the market can be and how anything can happen at any time.
Yes, Michelle. And second takeaway, the market is down right now. Check your feelings. See how you are doing with the market being down. Do you feel totally fine and you're not really worried about it? Awesome. Your emergency fund is probably perfect. Or you're just risk tolerant, which is different, right? Some people are just more risk tolerant, which is fine. Maybe they have a lot of friends' couches to sleep on. Totally cool.
That does make a big difference.
Right? Take a look at how you're feeling. If you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling like you want to withdraw your money from the market, if you're feeling like maybe you should start investing in gold or cryptocurrency, then maybe your emergency fund is just not big enough. So keep in mind that maybe you should just be storing more cash to allow for more security and more stability during these down markets.
I agree, Sammy. Especially if you have an income right now, especially if you're in a place where you're like, hey, I'm bringing in money, I am financially stable. Is there something I can do to make myself more stable by putting a little bit more money towards a savings fund, putting more money into an index fund, whatever it is you need to do. Like the time to think about it is when you have a job, when you have stability, and when you have income coming in. Because again, I don't know how many more of these people can today handle a $400 unexpected purchase.
And the last takeaway I would recommend, Michelle, is thinking what are your large expenses that are coming up? Because you do want to protect that emergency fund. Think about what your upcoming expenses are, and if you know that you're going to need some extra money, make sure you save enough to pay for all those expenses so you don't have to start going down on your emergency fund, because you want to protect that for true emergencies or true instances where you really need the cash.
Agreed, Sammy. And I want to say that it is very common for people to have a quote-unquote emergency fund and then to spend through it the next month, refill it, spend through it, refill it. And so that's part of the reason we're saying this too, is because that's not an emergency fund. That's just money that you're spending every month that you have in cash. You do want to make sure you have some money that, again, if you have no income coming in for whatever reason, you're able to live off that for whatever period of time you feel most comfortable with. And I'd add to that, I know inflation is 7%. It's a crazy time, but at the same time, I was doing my net worth tracking and my savings had a higher increase than my investments the past month.
That's very true right now.
Which is rare. It's not a reason not to invest in the market. But
for sure, no.
It is an interesting thing because people do say, like, if inflation is high, your money is losing purchasing power. At the same time, like, there are a lot of other things that are going well in the economy. A lot of people are able to get jobs right now, those type of things. And so it's a good time to reevaluate and say, hey, if I'm doing good right now, how can I protect myself in the future as well?
Yeah, Michelle, that pretty much sums it up. Think about your future self and protect them.
Exactly. And put $1,000 under your mattress. Just kidding. Unless you want to.
You can do that if you want.
And then set it on fire. Never set your money on fire. Or throw it in the ocean.
Why?
Kodak Black.
What does that mean?
That's the rapper. He was throwing his money in the ocetion.
To reduce the overall inflation for the economy?
Yes. He's actually really big. He's really involved with the Fed.
It's like, if they won't fix it, I'm going to take it into my own hands.
You know what? $10,000 in the ocean. 6.9999% inflation now.
Which ocean?
Thank you guys so much for listening. Once again, share this with a friend. Share Status Post Adulting with a friend. We're growing. We're so excited about it. We're so happy you're all on this journey with us.
We are growing, people.
We're growing. Check our newsletter out. We'll send you some interesting extra details if you sign up for that. And we love you. We think you are all doing an amazing job. We talk to a lot of you, and we are so excited and happy that this community is not only lifting themselves up, but lifting their peers up as well.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next time as we put down the rulebook and rethink the status quo.